Hello and welcome to Talking Till Dawn, where we investigate the strange, the macabre and the unexplained. Tonight, my partner in crime is, as always, the dastardly Dean of Dread himself, Mr. Martin Yates.
Hello.
How the hell are you, Martin?
I'm not too bad, how are you?
I am absolutely fine. Once again, we shall pretend that we haven't just had a half an hour conversation asking each other how we're doing before the episode began. I'm fine. I wanted to thank everyone over on Patreon. They've really helped us keep the lights on here at the old cabin while we busied ourselves behind the scenes preparing new episodes.
Definitely. Yeah, just a quick greeting to the wonderful people who signed up for our Patreon since our last episode. And it's been a little while, so at the Nightbird level, we're joined by Hugh Langridge, a longtime friend of Talking Till Dawn. Thank you so much, Hugh. And glittering in the night sky, like the jewels they are, our newest Dawn stars are Evie, Tomato Sword, Aneski Williams, Elise Daniels, Onyx, Stephanie Farilli, and Ross Evans. You guys rock. Your support for the show is beyond amazing. Humbling. Thank you guys so much.
So a big thank you to you all, and if you want to support the show and receive exclusive deleted scenes, hopefully some Q&As with us at some point, Martin, I think that would be fun to do.
Yeah.
There's bonus episodes and stuff there for you to enjoy. You can check that out at patreon.com/talking till dawn. The links are in the show notes below.
Also, Hugh Langridge, who I just mentioned, is an author too, Michael. And if our listeners recall, a couple of years ago, we put out an episode on the subject of number stations. And if you found that topic interesting, then you should definitely check out Hugh's novel, The Tolworth Beacon. It's a suspenseful, eerie mystery revolving around number stations and sinister forces making their presence felt in suburban England.
Fantastic.
I do recommend it. You can get it on Kindle for pennies last time I checked, so well worth a look. The Tolworth Beacon by Hugh Langridge.
Cool. Well, the night is quickly enveloping us, Martin, so it's time to dig deep into tonight's topic. A strange and mystifying true crime that puzzles even the most dedicated of detectives. Are you ready?
Always ready to be puzzled.
Splendid. You got your deerstalker hat on. So I've pieced the strange accounts of this case together from several sources, but I want to especially acknowledge and praise Martin Sizemar, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who in 2018 gained access to a roll of microfiche at the Kansas City Police Department dating back to April of 1935. It was the first time anyone had seen police records pertaining to tonight's case, and Martin Sizemar was then able to write a fantastic article about it for Kansas City magazine. So a big thank you to him for his amazing research. In those records, he unearthed a memo from the then police chief of Kansas City, Otto Higgins, who tellingly described this case as coming, quote, nearer to being the perfect crime than any other murder Kansas City has seen in his quarter century as a detective, unquote. And it still ranks as a puzzling episode in their records even to this day. Let me take you back then, Martin, to Kansas City.
Kansas City.
I know, I just think that Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I love Venice.
I'll never forget the canals of Kansas City.
Apologise to our friends in Kansas City. It is December of 1933. The city has, for several years, become one of the country's most vibrant places, or perhaps degenerate, depending on your point of view. Kansas City sidestepped the prohibition, and so by 1933, when prohibition finally ended, KC, as some call it, had a head start when it came to jazz clubs that opened until dawn and organised crime syndicates, making a mountain of cash by giving the people what they wanted. Otto Higgins himself, the police chief we mentioned a moment ago, would eventually be charged with tax evasion, a well-known tactic by this time to get rid of anyone who was under the control of the mob.
Been long awaiting the day we could finally get into the tax evasion Talking Till Dawn episode. The most macabre of the true crimes.
Where we investigate the strange, the macabre, and the very, very dry.
Accounting Till Dawn.
Can't think of anything worse. being self-employed, I have sat doing my taxes and just been like, this is soul destroying. Anyway, the bright lights and easy access to alcohol, gambling and prostitution make Kansas City, as it heads into 1934, a place with an almost gravitational pull for young men drifting around the country after the Depression and looking for adventure and work. Poverty and its evasion of prohibition have made Kansas City a desirable and palpably dangerous place in equal measure. In April of 1934, a 19-year-old man living in Birmingham, Alabama, sets out to hitchhike across the United States with a close friend for company. The young man's movements around the country are uncertain, but we know that he will indeed end up in Kansas. His companion, a man by the name of Joe Simpson, will later claim that they parted ways when they reached the heat and bright lights of Los Angeles. Writing to his mother, the 19-year-old, who we will call Roland T. Owen, claims to have made it to Kansas City halfway through August. He signs into more than one hotel during his stay in the city, and it appears that he has been travelling with someone named Don Kelso, who has signed the guest book at more than one location. Not much is known about Roland's life in the city over the next few months, but by the time New Year arrives, it appears his fortunes have changed. Perhaps his money, but most definitely his luck, has run out. On January 2nd in 1935, Roland books himself into the President Hotel in downtown Kansas City. As an aside here, I always wondered why people used to use the term downtown in America, and it appears to come from an area in a city that is lower down by the water. Apparently Manhattan was one of the first places to be labelled downtown, but Boston lays claim to having used the term for the centre of the city back in the 1700s. That is a complete terrible segue. It's not really even a segue, aside rather, so I do apologise. So back to Roland and the President Hotel. Bizarrely, for a man who's described by witnesses as being well spoken and well dressed, he checks into the hotel with only a suit, a black comb, a black hairbrush and some toothpaste. Not the belongings of someone who expects to be travelling around for some time, but we'll get back to that. Roland has a specific request about his room, that it's not on the ground floor and that it has a window that faces out to the street in front of the building. The room he is given is 1046. These events were recorded by the hotel staff who attended to Roland and his room during his stay. The police records mention a maid named Mary Soptio, who first notices some strange goings-on. This begins when Roland allows her to clean the room one morning. While she cleans the room, Roland sits and combs his hair. He then asks, is that not strange enough?
Do you like my locks?
Come in, my pretty, I'm combing my hair. Would you comb my hair, please? Roland sits and combs his hair. He then asks her not to lock the door on the way out, as he's expecting a friend in a few minutes. It's as if he wants the friend to come into the room of his or her own accord to find something or see something. The maid, Mary Soptio, is quoted in the police records as saying, quote, "My impression of this man from the expression on his face and his actions was that he was either worried about something or afraid. Why would someone who is afraid want a door left unlocked? Certainly if I feel unnerved, especially in a hotel room, I make sure the door is locked." You know what I'm saying, man?
Yeah, unless he's nervous because he wants some sort of alibi or he wants to be seen in the room with the maid. You know, something like that, rather than, you know, someone's coming to get me. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
In the afternoon of that same day, the maid comes back to the room to stock it with clean towels. I'm going to tell you throughout this account, there's a lot of maids and bellboys going back and forward from this room to give them new towels. It seems to be something that back in the day happened several times throughout the day.
The guy was just wearing them as togas 24/7.
Anyway, Mary Soptio went back to the room in the afternoon to bring these towels, and she enters the room and finds that it's bathed in darkness. The blinds are closed tightly with no lights on. She can see that Roland is sitting on the bed, fully dressed and silent. Unnerved by this, she leaves the towels and finishes her shift as quickly as possible. But the next morning, she must attend to room 1046 and its occupant once more. She discovers that the door is locked, and with no do not disturb sign, she uses her key and enters the room. Mary assumes the guest is out of the room. However, Roland is there, sitting in complete darkness. What makes this event stranger still is that Mary knows how the locks on guest rooms work. If a guest locks the door from the inside, her key would not have worked.
Okay.
The fact that she was able to use her key can mean only one thing. Roland was locked into his room from the outside by an unknown person. While in the room, Mary notices a handwritten note on the room's desk. It reads, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. -- wait." Mary continues to clean the room when the phone rings. Roland answers it.
Oh, he's alive. Sorry, just a second. For quite a long time there, I assumed that you were building to it. He was sitting in the room, it was dark, room was locked from the outside, he was dead, so I'd already assumed that was coming.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I thought when I was reading the accounts of this. And it's kind of part of the strangeness of it, when he's just sort of sitting there in the bed.
So it's like he's been locked in that room, just chilling in the room, but someone has locked him in, and he's just sitting there waiting for the maid to come.
Yeah, but then he's not saying anything to the maid, he's just sitting there in the darkness, sitting up in the bed.
Yeah.
It's quite a creepy image to me.
Yeah.
So this handwritten note, it uses the name Dawn and says, "I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." So Mary continues to clean the room when the phone rings. Roland answers it. Mary later states to police that she hears him say, "I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. I just had breakfast." The maid also states that she hears Roland refer to the caller as Dawn, just like the handwritten note. And similar to the name Don or Donald Kelso that had been recorded in other hotels where they had stayed, not, interestingly, at the President Hotel itself. As far as the staff is aware, Roland is alone.
Right.
Later on the same day, Mary hears two men arguing with each other from inside room 1046. She knocks on the door to ask if Roland needs fresh towels again. I have written in brackets, apparently these were changed twice a day, but it feels like more than that. She hears a man with what she describes as a rough voice. He speaks from behind the door and tells her that they don't need towels.
You'd have a rough voice if you were eating towels all day as well.
Yeah. Do you need towels? I couldn't possibly manage another one. Do you have any of those wee hand towels? Maybe I could just manage one of them.
Could you put some fabric softener on?
Yeah. Other guests on the floor hear the same arguing Mary does, and this continues into the night. One guest tells police later that, along with a lot of noise coming from the room, a man and woman could be heard talking loudly and cursing. Back in the 30s, it was common for hotels to have switchboard operators. They would manually connect phone calls from rooms to the outside. Operators would have various lights on their switchboards and could see when a line was connected or disconnected. During the dead of night, not long after the arguing voices have grown quiet, the President Hotel's switchboard operator notices that the line to that room is open. There's only one explanation for this. The phone receiver is off its hook. A bellboy is sent to the room, this time not for towels. When the bellboy knocks on the door, he hears a man with a deep voice ask him to come in. But when the bellboy tries to open the door, he finds that it's locked. He then hears the man on the other side of the door telling him to turn on the lights. The man never unlocks the door. Eventually the bellboy assumes that the man is drunk and he shouts to him to put the phone on the hook and leaves. I do wonder what he would have found if he had gotten into that room at that moment. Morning comes, and when the day shift switchboard operator starts her shift, she notices that the phone in room 1046 is still off the hook. Or rather, has it been put on the hook and then off again? Another bellboy goes up to the room at 7:10 AM. He shouts through the door to see if the occupant of the room hears him. The bellboy claims he hears a man say something like, "all right," and so he just leaves. An hour later at 8:30 AM, another bellboy, this time by the name of Harold Pike, is sent up to Roland's room to put the phone back on the hook once and for all. Initially he knocks on the door, but no one answers, so he uses his key to enter the room. It's still in darkness, but Harold can see the vague outline of a man lying on the bed. He has no clothes on, and he seems to be breathing heavily. There is also a dark patch on the bedsheets and blankets around him. The bellboy believes this strange dark patch is a shadow of some sort. Later he will tell the police that he also believed the man in the bed to be drunk. So reading between the lines here, I do wonder if the bellboy thought that the man in the bed had soiled himself due to being too drunk.
A shadow of some kind.
It's a poo shadow. It was a poo shadow. I've seen them before.
A shadow right up his back.
Maybe he just didn't want to deal with that, you know. Harold Pike disregards the man and the patch on the bed, hangs the phone on the hook, and then leaves the room. So again, one wonders what might have happened when you know the whole story had he stayed. 2 hours pass, the phone is once again off the hook. Another bellboy is sent to the room, and when he knocks, no one answers. But after using his key, he pushes the door open, and what he sees horrifies him. On the floor is a naked man on his knees. Blood is oozing out from deep gashes in his head. The bellboy looks around in shock and sees blood smeared on the walls and covering the bed. So he panics, not knowing what to do, and rushes downstairs to alert his manager. In the 1930s, it was common for hotels and other large establishments to employ an in-house doctor. Change days indeed.
Yeah.
The manager contacts the house doctor and the police. The doctor rushes to room 1046, where the police are en route. The assistant manager and the bellboy who found the man accompany him. They rush up to the room, and what follows is a description of the doctor's account. On entering the room, the man is nowhere to be seen. He is no longer on the floor of the main room. They search and quickly find him now in the bathroom. He is lying in the bath covered in blood. His legs are drooped over the sides. Around his neck is some sort of cord. The police will later identify this as a cord from a washing line. The man's ankles and wrists are also wrapped in the same material. Lying flat on his back, the man is almost feverish, on the cusp of consciousness due to his wounds. When the doctor draws closer, he sees that there are several gaping wounds across his chest. He has been stabbed many times. The doctor attempts to stop the bleeding as they wait for an ambulance. During this time, the doctor asks the man who did it to him. Roland replies, "Nobody." He then says, almost unintelligibly, that he had fallen against the bathtub. These are his last words. The mysterious man in room 1046, known by the name Roland, slips into a coma. He tragically dies in a hospital the next day. When I read that he'd told them that nobody had done that to him, I found that incredibly sad.
Like it could be self-inflicted, but
Yeah.
they're unusual self-inflicted wounds if that indeed is what has happened there.
Yeah. An autopsy reveals that, as well as the stab wounds, Roland had been struck at least 3 times in the head, fracturing his skull, and one of the stab wounds had punctured his lung. The investigation into the death of room 1046 occupant had begun, and its revelations would only add to the folklore surrounding the crime. Even for a modern audience looking back at this investigation, there's no doubt of its unusual nature. The death of Roland T. Owen was widely publicised in the press at the time, and between the police department, Kansas City newspapers and the public, rumours, conjecture and speculation about the murder were rife. In fact, the bizarre facts surrounding the case would later lead it to the desk of even the FBI's most famous member, J. Edgar Hoover. Let's then look at the investigation and its aftermath, and why it still puzzles researchers even today, and we'll try to piece together just what happened, if such a thing is possible. Have you got your big magnifying glass in your notebook, Alan?
100%, yep.
First of all, the blood-stained hotel room at the President Hotel was almost completely empty of any belongings after Roland's death. His luggage and clothing were missing. All that investigators did find was a hairpin, a label that they believed had been torn from a missing necktie, a cigarette that had been untouched, and a glass. A woman's fingerprints were found on that glass, which lends credence to the witnesses who heard a woman in the room at some point the day before. Other than the autopsy and evaluation of the crime scene, investigators immediately set out to discover who knew Roland. so that they could question them and alert his nearest family. But they soon realised that the name he had given was fake. He had said his name was Roland T. Owen and that he lived in Los Angeles, but there was no record of someone of that name living in that city. With no identification and no clue as to who Roland was, identifying him would prove difficult, if not impossible.
It's an odd name. Well,
Yeah.
It's not odd, but if it is a sort of pseudonym, it could be like Rolling on My Own.
I
Just
thought that, yeah. Rolling on my own.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Mate, I think you have actually added something to this case.
Crack the case.
That no one, all the stuff I read about this, no one mentioned that.
Yeah.
Rolling T Owen, rolling on my own. That's fantastic.
I suppose the T kind of ruins it though, doesn't it?
Well, it splits it apart so it has the same sort of beat. Rolling T Owen, that's great.
The T stands for Through the Night.
Yeah, rolling. The police turned to the public. Not only were pictures of Roland printed in newspapers, but his body was stored at McGilly Memorial. The public was then encouraged to view the body, which they did in their thousands. This kind of reminded me a little bit of the Elmer McCurdy episode that we did.
Yeah. Why did people view the body in their thousands?
It was because,
At this point, was this already considered a very unusual case?
first of all, I think the pictures that people put out of him, people thought he was handsome, and people kind of...
Okay.
There was a kind of furor about this sort of young man dying in this strange way. And then also, the official line, I think, was, we're doing this because someone can identify him.
Okay.
But, with somebody charging $1 a go,
Yeah.
So no one was able to identify him, or if anyone did know who he was, they kept it to themselves for an unknown reason. Despite this, there was one line of inquiry that the police still had. As luck would have it, during the autopsy, Roland was revealed to have something unusual about him. Something so specific that anyone who did know him would surely recognise him immediately. On the left side of Roland's head, he had grown one specific patch of hair longer than the rest. This could be pulled back to reveal a large, hexagon-shaped scar on his scalp. The scar was so pronounced that no hair could grow there. Detectives investigating the case put the word out across the country to police departments and newspapers far and wide. This scar would eventually lead to someone recognising Roland, the dead man in room 1046. The man's mother knew the dead body was her son as soon as she heard the description, 2 years after his murder. She identified him immediately as Artemus Ogletree.
Oh, okay. That's much more normal than Roland T. Owen.
Yeah, you would think that was the made-up name. It's a tremendous name though, Artemus Ogletree. It's fantastic. Her 19-year-old son, who had left Birmingham, Alabama, months before his demise in search of adventure and opportunity, when all he eventually encountered was a brutal, unsolved death. It must have been common though back then for people just to travel long distances across the United States and
Be out of contact.
not hear from people for months, maybe even years.
Yeah, there was no mobile phones, there was no internet, there was no email. If you were wealthy, you might have had a phone in the house, but other than that, it would be letters. A lot of people probably weren't great letter writers. Yeah, communication was very, very different.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes I think you take technology for granted and you forget the profound impact even just the last few years has had on how people communicate with each other. And some of it's good, but it's not all good.
No.
I used to think that back in the 90s when I first got a computer with an internet connection, I thought, this is it. This is going to bring everyone together.
Yeah.
I was very naive.
It did, that's the problem. It did bring them all together.
Nobody likes each other.
They're just old dicks.
Yeah. So Artemis's mother, Ruby Ogletree, would go on to be a critical part of the bizarre aftermath surrounding her son's death. In fact, it's some of the events which followed involving her that have made the case endure all these years later, and left true crime bloggers and detectives alike scratching their heads at the puzzle of Artemus Ogletree's untimely end.
Yeah, the 1930s true crime bloggers were absolutely going spare over this case.
True crime telegrammers. There is unnerving evidence that someone, an unknown player in all of this, took a keen and unhealthy interest in Artemis's death. Just before his body was finally identified, it had been suggested in the local press that nobody knew quite what to do with Artemis's body. It's possible that as a John Doe and with no family coming forward initially that he could have been cremated, but it was announced soon after by the police department in Kansas City that he would be buried in a potter's field.
Yeah.
However, an anonymous man came forward to intervene and ensure that this was not the case, but his intentions were suspicious. A potter's field was a term for a patch of ground where those in utter poverty would be buried, unable to buy a plot in a normal cemetery. However, the term is even bleaker than that. The term potter's field is mentioned in the Bible, in Matthew 27:7, and they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. So these places were often a final resting place for the forgotten and the impoverished. They were called potter's fields even back in antiquity because the ground was where potters would dig up clay to make pots and other things. This meant that there would be many holes cut out of the ground already. A minimum effort then to dispose of a body. You wouldn't even need a gravedigger.
Oh, right.
Except to cover the remains with soil.
Yeah.
Of course, by the early 20th century, some care would have been taken with the bodies of the forgotten, but even still, the term potter's field remained. There was a stigma to it. It wasn't a resting place where you would want someone you knew to be buried.
Yeah.
Perhaps then that is why an anonymous man called the police department and said he would pay for a proper burial for Artemis. It was even suggested by some that the caller had offered to pay so that Artemis's body could be laid near a plot where the caller's sister had been buried, though this isn't recorded in the police records, so it may be a piece of folklore that was born out of the case.
So the caller wanted to bury this unknown guy near where the caller's sister was buried, is that right?
Yeah, that was my reading of it, but to be fair, I do remember reading over that part of the case, and because that's not actually in the police files.
Yeah.
There are some parts of this case that were reported in newspaper articles at the time.
It's tricky to know what the implication of that is supposed to be, that whether it's a case of we're supposed to imagine that this woman and this guy are somehow related to the dead man, or, you know, whether it's a case of I've got a dead sister in need of a good husband.
Yeah.
It could also just be a guess that if this is a high profile case, it's been in all the papers and it's been announced this guy's going to get dumped in this bit of unconsecrated ground with no headstone. Maybe he's a philanthropist or something. He's got some money and he's like, it's a shame. I'll put forward a few quid to get him buried somewhere nice. Maybe it's just that.
Or I hated my sister and I'm just going to put this random guy.
Yeah.
You put this random guy in with her. That would really annoy her.
Yeah.
One thing is for certain, and that is that the anonymous caller definitely did exist. His call to the police department is at least logged in the files. So could it have been a good Samaritan, like you said, Martin? Of course, Artemis's body and his untimely death was a hot topic in the area. However, a memo exists within the files, recorded by the police officer who took the call, which suggests the caller had a connection to the victim. When the officer asked the caller why he was offering to pay for a funeral and what his connection to the unidentified man was, he was quoted in this file as saying, "Owen hadn't played the game fair, and cheaters usually get what's coming to them." So who's the Owen that the caller was referring to? Do we assume that it is referring to Artemis's fake name of Roland T. Owen? Had he cheated someone out of money and his death was the result? Or, and I know this is a long shot, maybe a big coincidence, but was the caller referring to someone with the first name Owen, the person who killed Artemis? Perhaps Owen was the murderer and had been dealt with already. Maybe one of the reasons Artemis used that name was some sort of insult. Maybe he was using someone else's name.
It seems to me, I don't know, my associations I tend to make with that era and with this kind of crowd, I guess, would be that the game could literally be some sort of gambling.
Yeah.
The Occam's razor application here would be that he was either involved in crime in a way where, you know, it was treated as a game by the participants, like it may well be by people involved in gangs, or he was literally involved in a game that had a lot at stake and didn't uphold his end. either cheated or welched on a bet or something like that. That, at least so far, that would be my kind of initial impression.
Or is it referring in some way to life in general, the game? Some people might think of it that way, playing the game unfair or...
Yeah, it sounds like he's talking about something specific there.
No one knows for sure, but what is certain is that the money was sent for the funeral, and Artemus, just before he was identified by his mother, was buried. At the funeral, flowers were sent. They were comprised of 13 American Beauty roses. Some have argued by a person who knew the victim. A card was attached to the flowers which read, "Love forever, Louise." No one knows who Louise is or was. I've looked into this particular type of rose, the American Beauty, to see if there could have been any cryptic meaning to its use, and if we can infer anything about the sender. The American Beauty rose is somewhere between, it's like a sort of pink and crimson red in colour, though most often pink. There's a controversy about whether it was created in the US or whether it was first created as a hybrid in 1875 in France and then taken there. It was very popular until the 1920s, and it was often called the $1 million rose due to its high price of $2 per rose. It doesn't sound like much, but consider that in 1935 the average annual income for an American was $471. The 13 roses probably cost at least $26, and that wouldn't have included a florist dressing or arranging the flowers and delivering them. Mm-hmm. So whoever sent the American Beauty flowers will assume the Louise on the card had spent a lot of money on them. Interestingly, although I couldn't find much about the symbolism behind the American Beauty rose, I did find some information about funeral practices pertaining to its colour. So now obviously this changes depending on the region where the funeral is taking place, and the customs could have been different at the time. But my understanding is that the colour of the flowers generally shows the connection to the sender. White flowers, which is the colour I'd most readily associate with funereal practices, represents humility, innocence and purity. Red flowers represent love. But here's the thing, pink flowers, of which the American Beauty flower probably was at the funeral, is a show of gratitude. It's a way to say thank you. So if the flowers were pink, then what was the sender thankful for? What had Artemus Ogletree done for her? Obviously, there were 13 of the roses, which is commonly associated with bad luck or as an omen. Some religious practices, such as in Hinduism, have 13 days of mourning. However, and this is something I didn't know until researching this episode, but it's been a tradition for many years for roses to be sent in an uneven number. So 13 might just be a coincidence. Apparently this dates back to France, where roses were sold at the common markets in even numbers. By sending an uneven number of roses, you were shown that you either picked them yourself, grew them, or bought them from an upmarket source.
Yeah, kept one for yourself.
Yeah, aye. 12 roses are usually associated with romantic love, so despite Louise's message of love forever, it seems that the flowers may not have been a romantic gesture, but one of a more platonic love. And we have reason to believe this to be the case, as we'll get to shortly. During the frenzy surrounding the death and funeral of the man in room 1046, the police received mail from around the country. These letters were filled with theories and accusations about who had committed the murder. The police records contain many of these, including correspondence from a woman who claimed Artemus had fallen in love with the girlfriend of a dangerous gangster and therefore met a sticky end. A civil engineer from Iowa said that a signature, presumably in the guest book at the President Hotel and published in the press, was undoubtedly that of someone he personally knew. This was all based on the shape of the letter R in the name.
Yeah, hundreds of millions of people in the country, and
that's Tamza.
Can only be his.
Another man writing before Artemus was identified claimed that the victim was a friend he had grown up with, who ended up climbing the ranks within the German army, and that he was killed because he was a spy. None of these letters were taken seriously. Only when Artemus Ogletree was finally identified by his mother were the police able to pursue further leads.
Here's the thing, right? To go back to the roses just a second. If it's a case where there's this flood of spurious letters coming in with theories and ideas and claims about the deceased, so the case has obviously caused enough of a nationwide sensation to attract that. Why do we put so much emphasis on these roses then? because it seems probably the most likely solution is that someone
A lot of people sent flowers.
Yeah, someone who's maybe not that stable or is just a kind of hopeless romantic in a slightly nuts way.
Yeah.
Just looked at the case and has gone, oh, that's such a shame, I'm going to send him a bunch of flowers. Oh, he looks like a handsome man. I would have been attracted to him when he was, you know.
Absolutely. But the only thing I would say to that is that apparently, especially back then, people did put a lot of credence in the type of flower and the colour of the flower that was sent at a funeral. And if that was the case...
But if they were potentially the colour of flower that you would send to someone for romantic love, and it was someone who saw this supposedly handsome guy in the newspaper, and, you know, you get women who are obsessed with serial killers and write to them in prison, you know. With that in mind.
And marry them.
That kind of parasocial obsession that people have with celebrities or with criminals or with potentially, if it's a sensationalised enough case, with victims of crime. It could just be that springs to mind as a possibility, at least. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only thing, again, I would say to that is that my understanding is a lot of people think the American Beauty rose is red because of the film American Beauty, but the film's named after the rose, right? But there's the famous shot in that film with the roses, but I think the whole point is, from what I could see, the rose was probably pink. Right, it's a pink rose. Anyway, yeah, everything you've said is totally valid, and that would be a simpler solution. But just as likely could Louise have been someone who did actually know who he was. Yeah, possibly. But couldn't come forward. Like that letter where the woman said he fell in love with a gangster's girl. Could be. You don't know. Yeah, I mean, that could be the case. Yeah. It's just worth considering the opposite, because... Yeah, absolutely. Especially if there's like a huge outpouring of public interest. Yeah. And newspapers maybe cherry pick through all of that in order to find items that, when put together, appear to create a narrative. Yeah. That's a possibility as well, I think. So some other strange events were quickly brought to light that cast doubt on the benign intentions of the caller who had paid for the funeral, and resulted in the unusual curiosities of the case becoming yet more complex and confounded. It had taken nearly 2 years for Artemus to be finally identified. In that time, his mother, Ruby Ogletree, had been receiving correspondence from her son. If dead men could write letters, Ruby had read several of them. But this wasn't a supernatural event, no. Someone very alive was trying to persuade Artemis's mother that her son was alive, and she had assumed he was, even though he had long since been murdered in room 1046 of the President's Hotel. The first letter arrived just weeks after Artemus had died. The letter was typewritten, and it claimed to be from Artemus, telling his mother that he was travelling to New York. However, although Ruby hoped the letter was from her son, she found it unusual. To begin with, Artemus always corresponded by handwritten letter. This was typed, and it didn't read like something her son would have written. Other letters followed. In April of 1935, when Artemis's body remained unclaimed and Ruby Ogletree had every reason to believe her son was alive and travelling, she received another letter, this time claiming that Artemus was going to France. And it wasn't just strange letters that the mother received. 8 months after Artemus had been murdered, with Ruby still unaware of the events, she received a phone call on August 12th. It was long distance, and it came from Memphis, Tennessee. The voice in the phone claimed to be a man by the name of Godfrey Jordan. He spoke with Ruby for 45 minutes and told her that he was a good friend of Artemis's and that her son had been in Cairo in Egypt, where Artemis had intervened to save the man from, as he called them, a band of thugs. At the conclusion of the phone call, Ruby worried deeply that something was very wrong. The letters sent to Ruby remained locked up in the police case files of Kansas City for decades, until Kansas City Magazine and Martin Sizemar managed to gain access to them. I haven't read them all myself, as they aren't publicly available. There was a link to some of the case files that was attached to this article, but I couldn't seem to get it to work, so I can only convey the opinion of those who have seen these letters. The initial handwritten letters sent while Artemus was still alive focus mainly on his job prospects. He speaks about a man who has agreed to open a business with him in the spring. That means he'd have a few months to get through until then.
Perhaps it was cash flow issues that led him to Kansas City, hoping to make it to the time when this business partner would come through for him. Alternatively, he might have been trying to get his hands on cash to start the business in the first place. That could have led him into dangerous territory. The letters that Ruby received after Artemus had died were, as I said, all typed. They also contained unbelievable stories and the use of contemporary slang language, which Artemus wouldn't have used, at least not when writing to his mother.
It's interesting what that reminds me of a little bit. It's a case not that long ago, the last 20 years or so. I'm trying to remember, was it Todd Colehep, the serial killer who, I don't think he actually killed the woman. I think he kidnapped her and had her captured in a storage container or something, and he killed her husband. I may be getting the details completely mangled because I'm doing this from memory, but the main point was it was almost like a modern day version of that, because I believe he took over the girl's Facebook page and was posting as if he was her. I don't know if those details are accurate, but the point is that puts me in mind of a more modern case where instead of it being letters, it was social media that was used, but the similarities being strange use of language, misspellings that the person wouldn't have made, and people knowing something's not right here, but I can't quite put my finger on what it is. It's very similar. It's obviously a long-standing technique to make it appear as if a crime hasn't occurred.
Yeah, the more things change, the more human beings remain just as scummy. So, here's an extract from one of the letters. I'll refrain from a terrible 1930s generic American accent. I got poisoned on something I ate in some dump. I was laid up for a few days and my stomach pained me a lot, but I finally got over that. Then I got the flu and had to go to bed for almost 9 weeks, and I guess I was pretty sick. The letters were suspicious to say the least. Ruby contacted the State Department to see if her son had registered a passport. She then wrote to the customs authorities to see if he had ever travelled abroad without a passport. She even contacted the FBI and the president himself, Franklin Roosevelt. She wrote about the worry she had for her son. Quote, "I fear he has fallen into some gang or something has happened to him. He has always been a good boy and has high ideals. I simply must find some trace of him. If he is in trouble, I want to know." I think it's really heartbreaking to read that, to think of a mother receiving these strange letters from her son, but knowing deep down that something bad has happened, helplessly writing to anyone for assistance.
Yeah, but it is interesting that she, on the one hand, goes, he's a good boy, he has high ideals, but the first place her mind goes is he's joined a gang.
Yeah.
So does that give some insight? Counterintuitively, does that tell us something? The fact that those kind of contradict each other?
Possibly. So it was in November of 1936 when the man in room 1046, Roland T. Owen, was identified as Artemus Ogletree. Ruby saw the picture in some national publication about the mystery and knew the scar, a result of a grease burn when he was just 11 months old. So what happened to Artemus? Who killed him and why? At the time of the case, there was the suggestion by the police that he had been killed either by a male lover or for being involved in what the detectives described as, quote, sexual deviancy. Indeed, it appears that they fingerprinted and looked at the handwriting of other men simply because they were gay. Even though the gay community still experiences terrible persecution today, we have to remember that in the 1930s, merely entering into a consensual relationship with someone of the same sex was a crime, and many within the gay community were murdered for the terrible act of wanting to find love and intimacy.
Did they say what it was about the case that made them think he was gay, or that there was a kind of romantic or a kind of crime of passion element there?
So we don't know exactly why the detectives followed this line of inquiry. It could have been so that they could take some of the heat off of themselves. The public was less likely to be worried about the unsolved murder of a gay man. Could also have been a way to further persecute gay people, trying to show them as murderous and violent. Of course, it's also possible that despite these prejudices, that Artemus was indeed gay, and that the man he had been waiting for in his room wasn't just a companion, but a lover. It's often been suggested that there were no real suspects in the case, but the opening of the police files suggests otherwise. It wasn't until 1940 that police in Kansas City identified a potential suspect. The man's name was Thomas Wilbur Barlow. He had previously been charged with, quote, crimes against nature, and the detectives were having in mind a murder supposedly committed by a sex maniac in 1935. So there's a lot of loaded terms there. When they arrested the man, the police believed that Thomas Wilbur Barlow's handwriting was similar to the signature found in some of the hotel registries where Artemus was known to have stayed. The name of Donald Kelso was on the thoughts and minds of investigating detectives. Could Thomas Wilbur have been this Donald Kelso? It took 10 hours of interviews for the police to realise that Thomas Wilbur's rambling, conflicting stories were the product of a syphilis infection. Wilbur was never charged with anything, and it's likely he was a victim himself of homophobic persecution. He also wasn't the only suspect. In fact, a detective by the name of T.J. Higgins, the lead detective on the investigative team, was adamant that a suspect in New York was the killer. The suspect's name was Joseph Ogden, and he was, by this time, guilty of another murder. I found an article circulated by the Associated Press at the time of this other possibly connected murder, and I'm just going to read it for you. Joseph Ogden admits killing pal and putting body in trunk. Roommate attempted to ship it by express. Detectives traced number. New York, August 18th. Joseph Ogden, 36 years old, stood in the lineup at police headquarters today and told how he killed his roommate, Oliver George Senecal, 25, former convict, and then stuffed his nude body into a trunk and attempted to ship it by railroad express to Memphis, Tennessee. Arrested less than 9 hours after the crime was discovered, Ogden appeared indifferent as he faced the detectives. He was arrested after they traced the number 839 chalked on the side of the murder trunk to Ogden's street address. Detectives said they traced Murder Trunk, that is a great name for a band. Detectives said they traced the trunk to a dealer who said he sold it on Monday. Occupants of buildings near the trunk store said they saw a man waiting 20 minutes for it to open Monday morning. The principal clue, detectives said, was the number on the trunk. With it, they began a canvass of luggage concerns in the city. They then went to the West Side address to which the trunk was delivered and arrested Ogden in his 3-room second-floor apartment. Police said they found 2 pistols in Ogden's room, one of them a .32 caliber revolver from which 1 shell had been fired. When discovered, Senecal's body had a .32 caliber bullet in the head. Police said Senecal had been killed with this pistol. After first asserting his innocence, Ogden broke down, police said, and confessed he shot Senecal in a struggle for possession of the revolver. Detectives said Ogden's apartment appeared as though he had planned to leave. Most of the furniture had been removed and a trunk was packed. Neighbours said Ogden and Senecal had been living together about 3 months. Ogden said he and Senecal had quarrelled twice in the last 2 weeks and that Senecal had beaten him. I don't wish to make fun of the dead at all, but Senecal sounds like a rapper name. Cynical. The trunk was taken to the express office at the Pennsylvania terminal by 2 men in a taxicab who assigned it to Joseph Marshall in care of the American Express Company at Memphis, Tennessee. They said at the time it contained silverware worth $300 and that the $3 shipping charge would be paid by the receiver in Memphis. A tattoo had been cut from the inside of Senecal's right forearm, but another was overlooked. The body was identified as Senecal's through fingerprints taken in several cities where he had been arrested for various offences. He was about 25 years old. That was how this second murder was reported at the time. It turns out that the body had been dismembered. Ogden had a history of incarceration and he had also been in what were termed insane asylums for, quote, a history of homosexuality. The fact that Ogden was most probably gay put him in the firing line for the detectives on the case. However, despite this, there are other reasons to believe that if he didn't actually kill Artemus, that he was possibly travelling with him and present at the hotel. Ogden had several aliases he used as he travelled around the country, but one of them was Donald Kelso. If you remember, the maid had heard Artemus talk about a Don, and he had travelled to other hotels with a man using the name Donald Kelso.
Yeah, that sounds...
Sounds likely, doesn't it?
It's not a super rare name, but it's not that common either. It'd be a big coincidence, let's put it that way.
It was even reported by the New Yorker sometime later that Ogden was the killer, even though he was never found guilty of the crime. Case closed. Possibly, but possibly not. The FBI looked at the case in 1950, and they assessed the handwriting of Donald Kelso. They concluded that whoever had written Donald Kelso into the registry, it was not Ogden. The FBI did not believe that Ogden was the killer. Another possibility was Joe Simpson. He was the man who had originally travelled with Artemus, claiming to have parted ways with him in Los Angeles. Ruby Ogletree certainly thought he knew more than he was saying. She was so convinced of this that she got a hold of Simpson's high school records to see if he had any history of bad behaviour. She also asked to meet him several times, but was apparently stood up when he didn't show. Although she begged the police to investigate him, they informed Ruby that Joe Simpson had been interviewed and there was no need for further inquiry.
It's quite interesting that he stood her up. You think that in that situation, if your friend had died, is this after he is turned up dead, or is this before he has appeared? Right.
This is when she knows.
Okay. So if your close friend who you'd start travelling with later turned up dead, and then his mother wanted to speak with you, you probably, if it's your friend, you probably would, even if it wasn't your friend, but especially if it's your friend,
pay your respects as well.
To pay your respects and to lend any help that you possibly could. So it does seem strange that he repeatedly stood her up. I suppose I can see maybe someone might just feel guilty for leaving him on the road. So maybe, an act of, I don't want to say cowardice, but maybe an element of shame.
Avoiding the confrontation.
Yeah, but it seems suspect.
Well, she did finally get to speak to him, because on December 28th, 1939, she finally found Simpson and confronted him face to face.
Okay. But she had to seek him out, though. That's still...
by the sounds of it, that's how it went down. Though she didn't get all of the answers she was searching for, Ruby told police that, in talking with the boy Joe Simpson, I was reasonably convinced that he is the person that talked to me from Memphis, Tennessee, 7 months after my son was killed. So that long 45-minute conversation that she had on the phone. During the conversation with Joe Simpson, Ruby claimed that he laughed about the chances of Artemus's killer ever being caught, saying there were no clues. When Ruby asked him if he was indeed the man who called from Memphis, claiming to know her son and having been saved by him in Cairo, Joe Simpson became red in the face and sheepish. Joe Simpson later claimed that he had in his possession a letter from Artemus which was badly typed, but although he told Ruby he would hand it over to her, he never did. Before we try to make sense of all of this, I'd like to offer for your consideration a handful of other claims that were made in some sections of the press through the years that followed Artemus's death. I can't verify these, and it's possible some of these points are embellishments, but they are worth exploring because they did appear in print. The first is that a witness claimed to have given a ride to a man fitting Artemus's description the night he died. The witness said that he had a deep cut on his arm and was cradling another wound on his other arm. The story goes, as reported by some newspapers, that when the witness viewed Artemus's body at the funeral parlour before he was identified, he was certain that it was the same man, and that he could see one of the cuts he had observed while the man was alive. Interestingly, the witness said that Artemus was angry, as though he had been in a fight, and that he said he was going to kill someone the next night. However, detectives dismissed his claim as the hotel staff maintained that Artemus had never left the building. It's possible he sneaked by unnoticed, so the jury is out on that one. Another claim is that one of the witnesses who was staying in the hotel in room 1048, just 2 doors away, was held in suspicion. The woman's name was Jean Owen, carrying the same second name that Artemus had chosen while checking in.
Okay.
Detectives questioned her in case there was any connection, and she also had a boyfriend who happened to work at a florist's. A tenuous link to the pink American Beauty roses, I know, but worth mentioning. It was the boyfriend who gave Jean Owen an alibi. One of the hotel staff claimed that a woman who often frequented the hotel, most probably a prostitute, was visiting people on the same floor as Artemis's room, and there was suspicion that she may have been the woman heard in room 1046. I also found mention of an expanded account between the funeral director who was holding Artemis's body and the anonymous person who was going to pay for the funeral. In this account, appearing in a newspaper from 1943, the caller said that Artemis had broken off an engagement, perhaps even cheated on his fiancée, and, quote, cheaters get what's coming to them. So that was the person who'd paid for the funeral.
Sure.
Which is a little bit similar to what we did here earlier on in the case. And this is in an expanded account, it's not in the police files.
As you say, we don't know the reliability of this information because it's not from the police account, but that does put a different spin on things. You know, if he is engaged to someone and then he breaks it off and then dies, could well be some connection there.
Yeah. I mean, some of this stuff seems a little too on the nose, and I would have loved to get access to the direct case files so that I could personally verify what did appear and what did not in those files. As I mentioned before, they were available for a short time online, but they seem to have been taken down. So if anyone is able to source them, please do let me know, because I would love to read them. So what happened to Artemus Ogletree? What are the possibilities? Let's quickly look at some of them. Some have suggested, given the association between Kansas City and organised crime at the time, that he had fallen afoul of the local mob. I do wonder if the businessman Artemus mentioned who wanted to set up a business in the spring with him, if you remember he mentioned that in a letter to his mother, was this bankrolled by a gangster?
Yeah.
One suggestion is that the name Don, D-O-N, used both on a note and in a phone call Artemus had that one of the maids overheard, refers to the term used for a mafia boss. Another alternative is that the engagement claim is true. Artemus was killed by the family of whoever he jilted. Could that have been the woman Louise who sent the roses to Artemis's grave? Perhaps the jilted lover was even present as he was tortured and killed. Officers did find a woman's fingerprints in the room, and a woman's voice was heard in room 1046 that night. Or perhaps the woman was there to try and save him, to warn him of what was coming. Was Artemis the victim of Joseph Ogden, a man who would go on to dismember the body of another young man in New York? He did use the name Donald Kelso, the same name that had appeared on hotel registries while Artemis was travelling around.
Yeah.
But then the FBI did not seem swayed by this. Ruby Ogletree was certain Artemis's friend Joseph Simpson was involved somehow, and was the man who had called her to say that Artemis was alive and well in Cairo. Why was someone so intent on making Ruby think her son was still alive? To me, there are two possibilities here. One would have been so that Artemis would never be identified. If he was never identified, then there was less chance the killer would be revealed. A second reason could be guilt. Perhaps the killer, or someone who felt responsible, thought it was best to weave tall tales so that Ruby at least believed her son was off in far off lands having the adventure of a lifetime. That was certainly preferable to knowing the horrible truth. Or maybe Artemis was simply unlucky and was a drifter who crossed paths with the wrong person at the wrong time. Whatever the truth, I can't shake the feeling that given the maids and bellboys' accounts, that Artemis was waiting for someone in that room. The maid had said he seemed worried, frightened even, and yet he left his door unlocked. He also asked for a window looking out to the front, and I do wonder if he was wanting to keep an eye on who was coming and going from the hotel. Did Artemis see his fate coming and feel helpless to avoid it? Was he waiting in that darkened hotel room to meet his end and get it over with? He managed to tell the hotel doctor that it wasn't a suicide attempt. His wrists were bound and he had marks in his neck as though he'd been strangled. Is it possible that what we have here is some bondage fetish gone wrong? A sex game gone too far? Or is that thought brought about only by a modern perspective, reinterpreting the past through contemporary ideas?
There's nothing new about that. You know, that stuff goes back hundreds of years, thousands of years.
Yeah, of course. But what I mean is some of these things become more prevalent in the sort of popular consciousness. And I think that sometimes because of that, we can maybe attribute something from that popular consciousness to something else that maybe it's not that. I don't know. I also keep being brought back to the phone. It was hung up several times and then pulled off the hook. A frightening thought is that the killer or killers were indeed in another room nearby, going back and forward from room 1046, torturing him, taking it further each time until it was too late. Maybe they wanted information from him. Artemus certainly didn't have any money. He refused to say who had tied him up and stabbed him. Was this out of loyalty, fear, confusion, or darkest of all, did he somehow want what happened to him that night? Death by arrangement. All I do know is that Artemus was a teenager, barely a man, and no one deserves a fate like that. I'll finish by telling you this. In the early 2000s, a historian in Kansas City, John Horner, received a phone call from someone wanting some information about the case. The caller explained that they had recently been cleaning out the belongings of someone who had passed away at a ripe old age. Among the belongings was a shoebox. The shoebox contained newspaper clippings following the story of Artemis's murder going back decades. Whoever the deceased had been, their interest in the case seemed personal. Once John Horner told the caller everything he knew about the case, the call ended abruptly, but not before one piece of information was passed the other way. Inside the shoebox was an item. It was connected to the case and apparently had been mentioned in several of the newspaper stories investigating the events of Artemus Ogletree's murder. The caller never divulged what that item was, but it does suggest that this mystery has another layer to it, ready to be explored when the right inquiring mind comes along. So Martin, what do you think happened to the man in room 1046?
I don't know what happened to the man in 1046, but it feels to me that maybe there's a lesson here, and not a lesson necessarily, but it could be one of these cases where attempts to use the press to resolve a case, to put the question out there, to put it in front of more eyes in order to get answers, may actually have muddied the waters a little bit. It's not the only time that that's happened. That's that goes all the way back to Jack the Ripper and so forth. When a case becomes a sensation like this, suddenly it becomes really difficult to separate out some of the contacts that are made, like the roses and the letters and all of that kind of stuff, that are genuine and those that result from the hysteria. And also, I don't know, a lot of the stuff around the hotel room and a lot of the things with people saying, well, I thought I heard a woman's voice in the room. It's a hotel, there's a corridor of many, many doors. Did they really hear a voice coming from that room? Was it from a different room? How much of the narrative that we have is put together from the press trying to create a kind of sensational narrative, It's hard to know. It's really hard to unpick. It is a fascinating case. It is a tantalising case. And it's a sad case. I think that most of all, it's not gruesome. It is, but it's not our most gruesome. It's not scary, but it is really sad. It's tragic.
Yeah.
And there's just so many unanswered questions there. And it could be, it's not a nice thing to think about, but there could be an element of mental health issues. Yeah. Self-harm, things like that. We just don't know. There might not even have been a murder. Yeah. It could have been a sex game gone wrong, as was suggested. It could have been a revenge murder. It could have been a sex murder. It could be, the options are so wide open. I don't think I could even possibly hazard a guess as to what happened in that room.
Yeah. I think what strikes me about it is that a lot of the strangeness kind of came out after. You do wonder in that time when we were talking about people travelling all over the country.
Yeah.
How many times did things like this happen? Probably, I hate to say it, probably wasn't that uncommon.
Yeah, exactly.
And it just takes it to be, like you said, to fall into the press, and then that starts to sell newspapers.
Yeah, exactly.
And the whole thing kind of then feeds on itself. So there are probably a lot of incidents like this, and I would imagine, especially in hotels, where
transient populations and
strange deaths, unexplained deaths. I do get the feeling some of the descriptions, and it could have been mental health related, but some of the things where the maid was talking about him sort of sitting up in bed in darkness and all that.
Yeah.
Part of me does wonder if it was arranged, or I remember studying a bit of forensic psychology when I was at uni, and there was a forensic psychologist that came in and gave talks and was actually presenting cases to us and would present essentially crime scenes. And they were real and he would show them to us. And he was trying to go through the cases and trying to ascertain things about the people that were involved, both the victims and the murderers, by what was happening or what was present in the case. And the one that always stuck with me was a guy that was tied to this chair.
Yeah.
And he'd been asphyxiated. And it was one of those things where at first they thought, if you've seen the picture of the poor man, he was so tied to the chair with his hands right round the back and his ankles tied to the chair. You wouldn't have thought at first glance that it was possible, but they did conclude that he'd done it himself by the way the knots were tied. And you do wonder with some of this, could that have been an element of it? I don't know.
Because the first thing he said was, well, who did this? No one.
Aye.
And maybe he's covering for someone, maybe he's scared, or maybe he's telling the truth.
There's another possibility that I never really... Two other things that crossed my mind that I didn't put into this when I was writing the episode. One was that there was a tag from a necktie that was found in the room, like a half-torn tag. Now that could just have been left from a previous occupant of the room, I don't know, but part of me then's kind of like, yeah, well, was there someone being tied up with that sort of thing? And then the other thing that's really just occurred to me there when I was talking about that was, I mean, it's probably a really conspiratorially minded in terms of a solution to the case, but could some of the anomalies with the case been that the hotel staff were trying to cover up something that happened? The doctor saying, he said it was nobody.
Yeah.
All of that.
Even just at an individual level, when you've got stuff like, you've got to go up there and put that phone back on the hook. You can imagine you're a bellboy. I don't want to have to go into some guy's room. Guy's going to either be wrecked or he's going to be annoyed that I've gone in and just going to go up there and I knocked 6 times and no one answered. I'll just say, I think I heard a woman say, it's fine. You know, somebody said, I think I heard somebody say, go away. I probably would lie and say that, to be honest, if I really didn't want to go in the room.
I'd probably say I saw somebody dressed in the same uniform that the waiters use in the diner across the road, coming out the room covered in blood. I'd probably just say something like that.
Yeah. You know that guy that works on the 3rd floor? I saw him coming out with a big bloody knife and a hockey mask on. So I didn't go in. It's
a strange case. It's one of those ones that I think in a lot of ways it's kind of subtly strange.
Yeah.
It's not as bizarre as I think sometimes it's billed, but it's still an unusual one. And again, it's just, you think how much time has passed.
Yeah.
The poor man's murderer, as far as we know, has never been brought to justice, unless Ogden had done it, because he went to jail for the other murder. That doesn't mean that justice was served, but...
Interestingly, I haven't just looked up the other murder there. The other guy was Ogden.
Joseph Ogden.
Yeah, where have I got it? The guy killed Oliver George Sinecal, 30, a wavy-haired thief and drug peddler. So if it was Ogden that was involved with this guy, you wonder maybe if there's a drugs connection as well. That's another possibility. You know, was this 1930s sort of equivalent of a cartel, or, you know, this was the era of serious gang violence as well, so that's a possibility. Has he been tortured? You know, at this point he's drifting around the country. We don't really know what he was doing. He could have been involved in drug running across the country. The FBI was involved. It's a possibility as well.
Well, Martin, it has been fantastic to get back recording another episode of Talking Till Dawn, but
certainly has.
But I do believe the sun is coming up.
The sun is coming up. Thanks very much, Mike. That's been a really fascinating case. Every new piece of information, unfortunately, just opens more questions than it does answers.
I just think about it the next time you're staying in a hotel.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.